Before we dive in, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more thrilling, real-life stories from the underworld. We'd love to hear where you're watching from. Drop a comment below. Let's jump into it. The cold New York winter of 1978 seemed to bite at everything it touched. The city, shrouded in darkness, was alive with whispers, silent deals in alleys, hushed conversations in dimly lit bars. But in the shadows, there was one name on everyone's lips: Jimmy Burke. He wasn't just a player, he was a man who operated like a ghost. Calm, calculating, and precise, Jimmy didn't need to raise his voice to get what he wanted. His quiet strength was what made him dangerous. The plan was simple, yet audacious: steal millions in cash from the Lufthansa cargo terminal at JFK Airport. Every day, millions of dollars moved through that terminal, but no one ever seemed to notice. A small group of men with the right information could slip in and out, taking what wasn't theirs and disappearing into the night. For Jimmy, this was his chance to make a name for himself. This heist could make him untouchable. He wasn't in it just for the money. He was in it to prove something. But for Jimmy to pull this off, he needed the right crew. He needed men who were loyal, men who wouldn't crack under pressure. Men like Tommy DeSimone, a hothead with a quick temper, and Henry Hill, a hustler always looking for his way into the big leagues. Jimmy knew their weaknesses, and he knew how to use them to his advantage. But Jimmy also knew something the others didn't. In this world, loyalty was a currency that only bought you time. The inside man was Luis Vera, a small-time cargo supervisor with debts piling up faster than he could pay them off. Vera's life was hanging by a thread. He was desperate, and desperate men made mistakes. Jimmy didn't care about the details, as long as Vera could give him the keys to the kingdom. The timing was crucial, and Vera had already provided the intel they needed. Now, it was just a matter of execution. Everything was falling into place, and yet, as Jimmy looked over the blueprint of the plan one last time, a wave of unease washed over him. The plan was perfect on paper, but it always came down to the unexpected. In this line of work, one wrong move, one slip of the tongue, could bring everything crashing down. But Jimmy knew the stakes. He had planned for everything. Or so he thought. As the days went by, the crew prepared in silence. There was no time for distractions. Each man knew what was expected of him, and no one had room for mistakes. Tommy, usually the loudest of the bunch, had grown quiet, his nerves eating away at him. He was the type to get caught up in the thrill of the job, but even he knew that this one was bigger than any score they'd pulled before. He was starting to realize that the line between success and failure in this world was razor thin. Henry, on the other hand, was torn between excitement and fear. He had always wanted to be part of something big, but now that they were on the verge of the heist, the reality of it all was setting in. This wasn't a street hustle or a small-time job. It was a chance to make millions, but it was also a chance to lose everything. Henry's mind was racing, and no matter how much he tried to ignore it, the question kept coming back: was it really worth it? But Jimmy wasn't asking questions. Jimmy had a vision, and as long as everyone followed his lead, they would get through it. On the night before the heist, the crew gathered in a small, secluded room to finalize the plan. Jimmy, as always, remained calm, his voice steady as he went over the details one last time. The weight of the job was evident in the way his eyes never wavered from the task at hand. Tommy, however, seemed to fidget in his seat, glancing nervously at the clock as though every second was dragging on. "Listen up," Jimmy said, his voice cutting through the room like a knife. "Tomorrow, we get in and get out. We don't get greedy. We do what we're here for, and we leave. No exceptions." Tommy leaned forward, his eyes wide with excitement. "And the money? We're gonna be set for life, right?" Jimmy's gaze shifted to Tommy, and for a brief moment, there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something deeper, darker. "We don't get greedy," he repeated, his tone more serious now. "Stay focused." Henry couldn't help but feel a chill at the mention of greed. It was the one thing that could ruin them. They were all hungry for more, but Henry knew that hunger could turn into something far more dangerous. The crew spent the rest of the night preparing, checking their gear, and running through the plan again and again. They were ready. The next day, everything would change. But as Henry lay in bed that night, sleep refusing to come, one question lingered in his mind. Could they really pull it off? Could they really walk away with millions and live to tell the tale? Or would this be the job that finally brought them all down? The night before the heist felt eerily quiet. Jimmy had done his job, made sure every move was planned, every detail accounted for. The crew was packed and ready. Everything had been set up perfectly, except for one thing, the feeling in the pit of Henry's stomach. The money was there, just waiting to be taken. The team had a foolproof plan to get in, grab it, and get out without leaving a trace. But the closer they got to the moment of truth, the more Henry realized that there were too many ways this could go wrong. As he lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling, the sounds of the city outside began to fade into the background. His mind was caught in a loop, focusing on everything that could go wrong. He tried to quiet his thoughts, but all he could think about was how much he wanted to succeed, how much he needed this. Not just the money, but the feeling of proving himself. The next morning, Jimmy gave his final orders. They were to meet at the warehouse early, gear up, and make their way to the airport. Tommy, who had been unusually quiet since the meeting the night before, seemed more jittery than ever. He kept pacing, running his hands through his hair, and checking his watch every few minutes. "Focus, Tommy," Jimmy said, his voice sharp. "We've been through this. You screw up now, it's over." Tommy grunted, his eyes wild. He couldn't sit still. The thrill of the heist, the danger that had been so intoxicating in the beginning, now felt overwhelming. There was no going back now. They were past the point of no return. But Tommy wasn't ready to admit that fear had crept in. He kept his chin up, trying to convince the others, and maybe himself, that he could handle it. The warehouse was dark, save for the faint light that slipped in through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. The men worked in silence, the air thick with a mixture of tension and excitement. As the crew packed the last of the equipment into the van, Henry felt the familiar weight of the job settle on his shoulders. "We leave in 5 minutes," Jimmy called from the back of the room, his eyes never leaving the plans on the table. Henry nodded but couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It was probably just his nerves, but he couldn't help it. They had been cautious up until now, but the closer they got to the job, the more he could feel the pressure mounting. Every move felt like it could be their last. The van roared to life, and they set off into the streets. The roads were quiet, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Jimmy sat in the front, taking the wheel with his usual cool demeanor, while Tommy and Henry sat in the back, the duffel bags of cash between them. Tommy fidgeted the whole way, tapping his foot nervously against the floor of the van. Henry, on the other hand, couldn't focus on anything except the job ahead. He tried to reassure himself. This was their chance. Their shot at something bigger. But even as the excitement began to build, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. They reached the airport, their destination just ahead. The van pulled into a dark alley behind the terminal, the sound of the engine cutting out as Jimmy parked it in a secluded spot. The crew piled out, each man checking his gear one final time. Henry felt the adrenaline rush through his veins. There was no turning back now. They moved quickly, walking through the back entrances, their faces hidden in the shadows. The plan had been simple: get inside, grab the money, and get out. But as they reached the secured cargo area, something felt off. The door to the storage area was slightly ajar, the lock tampered with. Henry's heart skipped a beat. "Jimmy," he whispered, "something's wrong. The lock's been messed with." Jimmy's eyes narrowed as he approached the door, his hands slipping inside his jacket to check his gun. "Stay quiet. Let me handle it." Henry held his breath as Jimmy slowly nudged the door open. The cold steel of the room greeted them with a low, metallic hum. There, in the corner, stacked high, were the bags of money, just as they had been told. But the sight of it didn't bring the rush of victory Henry had expected. Instead, the creeping sense of unease grew stronger. "We're in," Jimmy said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Get the bags, and let's move." The crew moved swiftly, taking the duffel bags and packing them into the van. But as they loaded up the last of the cash, Tommy's eyes darted around nervously, his hand twitching near his sidearm. "Jimmy, something's not right," Tommy said, his voice barely audible. "I don't like this. We need to go. Now." Jimmy didn't respond. His eyes were still scanning the area, focused on the task at hand. He wasn't as rattled as Tommy, but even he could feel the shift. This was the point where things either went smoothly or everything fell apart. Just as they finished loading the van, the first siren blared in the distance. It was faint at first, but it was enough to set their nerves on fire. Tommy's face turned pale. "I knew it," he muttered, slamming the van door shut. "We need to get out of here, now." Jimmy's hand shot out, grabbing Tommy's shoulder and forcing him to calm down. "Focus," he hissed. "We've done this 100 times. Stick to the plan, and we're fine." But even Jimmy couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. They climbed into the van, and with one last look over his shoulder, Jimmy slammed the door shut, signaling for the crew to go. As they peeled out of the alley, the sirens grew louder. The city had woken up, and they were on borrowed time. "Stay calm," Jimmy instructed, his voice steady, but even Henry could hear the edge creeping into it. "No mistakes. We're getting out clean." But Henry wasn't so sure. As the van sped through the city streets, his thoughts raced. It wasn't just the sirens that worried him, it was everything else. The lock on the door, Tommy's panic, the sense that they'd been walking into something bigger than they'd planned for. They hadn't just stolen money. They'd stolen attention. And now, the city was watching them. The van sped through the streets, each turn bringing them further from the terminal, but Henry couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't truly escaping. The sirens were closer now, echoing in the distance, but what really bothered him was the unease he felt in his gut. There was something about tonight that didn't feel right. Tommy, who had been unusually quiet since they'd left the airport, suddenly broke the silence. His voice was frantic, almost desperate. "We need to get rid of the van," he said, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror. "They're gonna trace it. I know it. They're on us." Jimmy didn't respond immediately. He kept his hands on the wheel, eyes straight ahead. They were still moving at a decent pace, but Henry could feel the pressure building. Tommy's anxiety was infectious, and the calm, controlled atmosphere Jimmy had maintained was beginning to crack. "We're fine," Jimmy said, though the edge in his voice betrayed his confidence. "We stick to the plan. We've done this before. Just keep your cool." But Tommy wasn't convinced. He turned toward the back of the van, his eyes darting from the bags of money to the road behind them. "We can't keep driving. They're gonna catch us, Jimmy." "I know it." Henry kept quiet, watching the road ahead. He knew Tommy had a point, but Jimmy was the leader. If he said they were fine, then that was it. There was no room for questioning. The van turned down a dark street, away from the more populated areas. Jimmy's grip on the steering wheel tightened. He was trying to shake off the anxiety Tommy had set in motion, but it wasn't working. Henry could feel the weight of the moment. They were moving further away from the airport, further away from their last real chance of getting clean. But at what cost? They reached a narrow alleyway, the kind of place where no one would bat an eye if they parked a van for a few minutes. Jimmy slowed down and pulled in, parking behind a row of dumpsters. It was quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that made Henry's skin crawl. "We unload here," Jimmy said, breaking the tension. "We get the bags into the warehouse, then we lay low for a while. Don't say anything, don't do anything to attract attention." As they unloaded the bags, Henry felt a strange sensation creeping up on him. It was like the world had slowed down for a moment. Everything felt wrong. He didn't like the way the city felt right now, the way the tension in the van hadn't dissipated. Tommy's voice cut through the air, sharp with fear. "What if they've already found us? What if we're not as clean as we thought we were?" Jimmy snapped back at him, his voice hard. "You need to relax. We're fine. We'll lay low, and then we'll start making the money disappear slowly." We've got it under control." Henry couldn't tell if Jimmy was trying to reassure Tommy or if he was trying to convince himself. The plan was solid, and Henry knew that Jimmy had always been the one to make things work. But as they carried the bags into the warehouse, he felt something tug at him. Something wasn't right, and he couldn't ignore it anymore. The crew moved quickly, unloading the money and hiding it in the back of the warehouse. They had chosen this location because it was secluded, away from prying eyes. Jimmy paced back and forth, speaking in hushed tones to the men who'd been on the lookout. Henry kept his distance, leaning against the wall, his thoughts elsewhere. The unease in his chest hadn't gone away, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go horribly wrong. Jimmy stepped over to him, his expression unreadable. "Stay focused. We're almost done." Henry nodded, but the words didn't settle in. He could feel the weight of the situation growing heavier with every passing minute. It wasn't just the money, it was everything. The people they'd crossed, the risks they'd taken. Everything was on the line now. "Jimmy," Tommy said, his voice shaky. He was standing by the door, peering out into the street. "We're not safe. I'm telling you, something's coming. I can feel it." Jimmy walked over to him, his steps measured. "Calm down, Tommy. We've been through worse." But Tommy didn't seem reassured. His eyes were wild now, darting from the street to the rest of the crew. "I'm telling you, it's not over. We don't even know who we're dealing with. There's no way they don't know who we are by now." Jimmy glanced over at Henry, then back at Tommy. The decision was clear. "We're not leaving," he said, his voice steady. "Not yet. We waited out." The air in the warehouse felt thick, suffocating. Tommy, still on edge, turned to leave the room. He didn't get far before the door slammed open. "Jimmy," a voice shouted from the entrance. "We've got company." The entire crew tensed, hands going to their weapons, eyes darting toward the door. The sudden shift in the atmosphere was palpable. Henry's heart raced. This was it, the moment they'd all been dreading. Two men stepped into the warehouse, their faces masked, their eyes cold. The one in front had a gun in hand, and Henry could see the tension in the air as it all fell into place. This wasn't random. They were here for the money. And they weren't leaving without it. Jimmy's voice broke the silence. "Who are you?" The man with the gun didn't answer right away. He stepped closer, his eyes scanning the crew. "You know exactly who we are. Now, where's the cash?" It wasn't just the money they were after, it was power, control. And Henry realized, in that moment, that they were no longer in control. They were in too deep. Jimmy stayed calm, his hand inching toward his sidearm. But Henry could see the hesitation in his eyes. He knew this wasn't just a simple robbery. It was something bigger, something more dangerous than they had anticipated. The moment hung in the air like a loaded gun. They had two choices, fight or run. The tension in the warehouse was unbearable. The two men at the door weren't just looking for the money, they were looking to send a message. Henry could feel the cold air swirling around him, like the world had paused, waiting for someone to make the first move. Jimmy's hand hovered near his sidearm, but he didn't pull it out. Not yet. Not until he had no choice. Tommy, still on edge, stepped forward, his hand twitching toward his weapon. "What do you want?" he growled, his voice tight with fear and anger. The man with the gun didn't flinch. He simply looked Tommy up and down, then turned his gaze to Jimmy. His eyes were cold, calculating. "The money," he said, his voice low but commanding. "You've been keeping it quiet for too long. Time to share." Jimmy stood tall, his eyes never leaving the intruder. "You're not getting anything from us," he said, his voice calm but firm. "This is our score. You think we're just gonna hand it over?" The man with the gun chuckled, a sound that sent chills down Henry's spine. It wasn't a laugh, it was a warning. "I think you'll hand it over if you want to walk out of here. You don't know who you're dealing with, Jimmy." Henry's mind raced. This wasn't some random encounter. These guys weren't just after money, they were after power. They had the look of professionals, and Henry knew that the moment they pulled the trigger, everything would spiral out of control. He glanced around the room at the crew, their faces tight with anxiety. Tommy was shaking, his hands still hovering near his gun. But Jimmy, for all his calm, wasn't looking so certain anymore. This was the kind of moment that tested a man's will. The kind of moment where one wrong decision could lead to disaster. "Listen," Jimmy said slowly, his hands still hovering near his side. "You don't want to do this. You don't want to start a war over a few bags of cash." The man with the gun tilted his head, clearly amused. "A few bags of cash," he repeated, his lips curling into a smirk. "You think that's all this is? This isn't about the money, Jimmy. This is about making sure guys like you know their place. And trust me, you're not in control anymore." The words stung like a slap in the face. Jimmy had spent his entire life building this empire, this reputation of control, of being untouchable. And now here they were, backed into a corner, with their future hanging by a thread. Tommy's nerves finally snapped. "Screw this," he shouted, pulling his gun from his waistband and pointing it at the intruder. "We're not handing over anything. You'll have to kill us first." The man didn't flinch. He didn't even move. His eyes were cold, calculating, and it felt like he was waiting for Tommy to make the mistake he knew was coming. Henry's heart pounded in his chest as he realized what was happening. Tommy had just handed them an excuse. Before anyone could react, the man with the gun raised his weapon and fired. The shot rang out, deafening in the enclosed space. Tommy's body jerked backward, a look of surprise frozen on his face before he collapsed to the ground. Henry froze. Time seemed to slow. Tommy was on the floor, bleeding, and everything that had been built over the years, every plan, every moment of control, had just shattered in an instant. The man's eyes never left Tommy's body as he fell, and Henry's blood ran cold. "Move," the man said, his voice as calm as ever. He didn't seem to care that Tommy was dying on the floor. His focus was still on Jimmy, still on the money. He was like a machine, methodical, precise. He wasn't here for a fight. He was here for control. Jimmy, still standing, didn't move. His face was pale, his eyes calculating, but there was a flicker of something darker there, something more human. Anger? Regret? It was hard to tell. He hadn't expected this. None of them had. "You son of a bitch," Jimmy growled, his hand now fully on his weapon. But before he could make a move, the second man moved forward, pointing his gun directly at Jimmy. "Don't," the second man said, his voice low and steady. "We don't want to kill you. But we will if we have to." Henry's head was spinning. He couldn't let it end like this. He couldn't let them just walk away with the money, with Tommy's life. But in that moment, he knew he was just as trapped as the rest of them. Jimmy took a deep breath, his hands still clutching the gun, but his eyes now on the floor. He looked at Tommy, lying there, motionless, and for the first time, Jimmy seemed to waver. This wasn't a calculated risk. This wasn't a smooth heist anymore. This was survival. "We'll give you the money," Jimmy said, his voice hoarse. "But you don't walk out of here like you own us. You leave, and you don't come back." The man smiled, his face cold and triumphant. "You'll do what we say. Or we'll come back and finish the job. Your choice, Jimmy." There was nothing left to say. The crew was broken, and the plan had crumbled in a matter of minutes. The money, which had seemed like a key to a new life, now felt like a weight, a heavy, unforgiving burden. Henry could feel the sting of betrayal, the raw emotion of Tommy's death gripping him. He could feel the walls closing in, and there was no way out. The tension had cracked, and the balance of power had shifted forever. As the men turned and walked out, leaving Tommy's body behind, Henry stood frozen. There was no victory here. No triumph. Just the hollow feeling of what could have been. They had made their choices, and now, all they had was the wreckage. Jimmy stood silent for a long moment, his eyes on the door. It wasn't over. He knew it wasn't over. "Get the bags," he finally said, his voice tight with rage. "We move. Now." But Henry knew. This wasn't just about the money anymore. This was about survival. And in this world, survival came at a cost. The tension in the warehouse was palpable. Tommy's body lay motionless on the cold floor, a stark reminder of how quickly things could go wrong. The man who had pulled the trigger hadn't even flinched. He had done what he came to do, send a message. But the message was clear: there was no loyalty in this world, only survival. Jimmy stood over Tommy's lifeless body, his face a mask of cold rage, but inside, Henry could see the storm brewing. Jimmy had always been in control, always the one who made the hard decisions without hesitation. But now, there was doubt in his eyes, doubt about their future, doubt about his leadership, and doubt about whether they could get out of this alive. They had been through countless jobs together. They'd stolen, lied, and manipulated to get to where they were. But this wasn't just another job. This was personal. Tommy was one of them. And now he was gone. "Get the bags," Jimmy finally said, his voice quiet but sharp. The words were simple, but they felt heavy. The money was still there, still the goal, still the only thing keeping them moving forward. But Henry couldn't shake the feeling that it was too late. The damage had been done. They weren't going to walk away from this clean. Henry nodded, though the weight of the situation made his legs feel heavy. He moved slowly toward the duffel bags, still stunned by what had just happened. The crew, once so tight-knit, was already unraveling, and there was nothing they could do to stop it now. Jimmy had always been the one to hold them together, but now, with Tommy gone, it felt like they were all falling apart. They loaded the bags into the van, working quickly and efficiently, but the silence was deafening. No one spoke. There was no bravado, no excitement about the money that lay just out of reach. It was just survival now. Henry could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the anxiety eating away at him. They hadn't planned for this. They hadn't planned for Tommy's death. They hadn't planned for the fear that had settled in the pit of their stomachs. Jimmy climbed into the driver's seat without saying a word. The engine hummed to life, and they moved through the streets, as they always did, trying to stay hidden, trying to stay unnoticed. But the silence in the van was oppressive. No one looked at each other. No one said a word. The further they drove, the more Henry felt the weight of what had just happened. Tommy was dead. They hadn't just lost a crew member, they had lost something more. They had lost their sense of invincibility, the thing that had made them feel untouchable. They were no longer a team. They were just a group of people trying to survive. As they made their way to a secluded area on the outskirts of the city, Henry's mind raced. They needed to lay low, but how long could they stay hidden? They couldn't afford to stay in one place for too long. Every minute felt like a countdown to their capture, and with the man who had killed Tommy still out there, watching them, they had nowhere to hide. Jimmy stopped the van in an empty parking lot and turned off the engine. The silence in the van felt suffocating now. Henry couldn't take it anymore. "Jimmy," he said, his voice strained. "What now? What are we gonna do?" Jimmy didn't answer immediately. He stared straight ahead, his hands gripping the steering wheel. Henry could see the tension in his shoulders, the same tension that had been there since Tommy's death. "I don't know," Jimmy finally said, his voice low. "But we move. We can't stop now. We keep going. We get the money out of here, and then we disappear." But Henry knew it wasn't that simple. Tommy was dead, and everything had changed. They couldn't just disappear. They were marked. The man who had shot Tommy, whoever he was, wasn't going to stop. He wasn't going to let them get away with this. The crew had always been able to stay one step ahead, but that was before. Before Tommy's death, before the world had come crashing down on them. Now, they were exposed. Now, they were running out of time. "We don't get to walk away from this," Henry said, his voice quiet but firm. "We've made too many enemies. The money won't save us." Jimmy's eyes flicked to Henry, and for a moment, there was a flicker of something in them, something close to regret. but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the hard edge of a man who had made his choice. "Then we make our own luck," Jimmy said, his voice steady, almost mechanical. "We stick to the plan. We get out clean. It's the only way." Henry didn't believe him, but he didn't argue. There was nothing left to say. They were in too deep now, and Jimmy was right about one thing: they couldn't stop. They had no choice but to keep moving, to keep running, to keep fighting. But even as they drove away, Henry couldn't shake the feeling that they were running towards something far worse than they could imagine. The money was still there, still within reach, but now, it felt like a trap. A trap they couldn't escape. The night air outside the van was thick with tension as Jimmy drove through the back streets of the city. It was quiet, too quiet, but Henry couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in on them. They had the money, but at what cost? Tommy was dead, and now they were more exposed than ever. The sirens had faded, but they were still out there, watching, waiting for the crew to make a mistake. They needed to get rid of the money. That much was clear. But the deeper they went into this, the harder it was to know who to trust. They had always relied on their own instincts, but now, with Tommy gone, that trust was fractured. The crew had always been about survival, but survival didn't feel like a guarantee anymore. Henry glanced at Jimmy, sitting stiffly behind the wheel, his jaw clenched tight. Jimmy was trying to maintain control, but Henry could see the cracks in his armor. He could see the way his fingers tightened around the steering wheel, the way his eyes darted from mirror to mirror. Jimmy was starting to crack, and that was something Henry had never seen before. "We can't keep running," Henry said quietly, his voice barely audible over the hum of the van. "We're being hunted, Jimmy. They're going to find us." Jimmy's jaw tensed, but he didn't answer right away. He kept his eyes on the road, his grip tightening even more. The van swerved around corners, cutting through alleys, trying to stay off the radar, but the city felt too small now. Every shadow, every corner, seemed like a threat. "We get rid of the money," Jimmy finally said, his voice hard. "Then we disappear. That's the plan." Henry didn't answer. He knew Jimmy's plan, and he knew it was the only option they had left. But he also knew they were too far gone. They weren't going to walk away from this unscathed. And the longer they stayed in the city, the more likely it was that someone would catch up to them. As they neared the edge of the city, the streets grew quieter, the buildings more spaced out. Jimmy slowed down, pulling into a deserted parking lot. The van came to a halt, and for a moment, there was silence. No one moved. "Unload the bags," Jimmy ordered, his voice flat. "We're dumping everything here." The crew piled out, their movements stiff and cautious. The money was heavy in their hands, and Henry couldn't help but feel the weight of it more than ever. It wasn't just the cash. It was everything they had risked. Everything they had lost. Tommy's death was on their hands, and no amount of money could undo that. The bags were dumped into a dumpster, hidden beneath a pile of discarded boxes and trash. Jimmy gave one last look over his shoulder before they all climbed back into the van. "We go dark," Jimmy said as they started the engine again. "We disappear. No more jobs, no more messes." Henry's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. He wasn't sure if it was the exhaustion or the adrenaline, but he felt like they were being watched. He could feel it in his bones. The weight of the decision hung over them, and it was starting to feel like they were already running out of time. As they pulled out of the parking lot and onto the empty streets, Henry noticed something. The city was different now. It felt empty, like the streets had been drained of life. The hum of traffic, the buzz of city life, everything had gone quiet. It was as if the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. They drove for miles, trying to shake the feeling that they were being followed. But no matter how many turns they made, no matter how many roads they took, Henry couldn't shake the sensation that someone was out there, closing in. It wasn't just paranoia anymore. It was real. Jimmy glanced at him, his eyes narrowed. "What is it, Henry? You look like you've seen a ghost." Henry shook his head. "I don't know, Jimmy. I feel like we're being watched." Jimmy didn't respond. His focus was on the road ahead, but Henry could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes. They were both thinking the same thing. They couldn't outrun their past forever. The money was gone, but the consequences of their actions weren't. They drove for hours, staying off the main roads, trying to blend into the quiet outskirts of the city. Jimmy kept his eyes on the rearview mirror, his grip on the wheel never loosening. Henry watched him, studying his every move. Jimmy wasn't just driving. He was calculating, always a step ahead, always trying to stay one move ahead of whatever was hunting them. Eventually, the van pulled into a secluded area on the outskirts of town. The road was narrow, surrounded by trees and dark, empty buildings. Jimmy stopped the van, and for a long moment, no one moved. "We're laying low here," Jimmy said, his voice low. "No one knows about this place. We'll stay here for a while. Let the heat die down." The crew unloaded the van in silence, each man moving quickly but cautiously. They didn't say much. There was nothing left to say. As Henry stood by the van, his eyes scanning the darkened surroundings, he realized something. This was it. They had reached the point of no return. Tommy was dead, the money was gone, and they had no plan. They were just waiting for something to happen. Waiting for the inevitable. "Do you think it's over?" Henry asked, his voice almost a whisper. Jimmy didn't answer right away. Instead, he just stared into the dark horizon, his eyes distant. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "It's never over, Henry. It's just the beginning." And in that moment, Henry knew Jimmy was right. This wasn't the end. It was only the start of a much darker road. A road where there was no escape. The days in the hideout stretched into an uncomfortable monotony. They stayed in the secluded cabin on the outskirts of the city, far from the chaos of their old lives, but the silence felt suffocating. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustling of the trees outside seemed to echo louder than it should. The crew was on edge, and Henry could feel it in the air. Jimmy had kept them quiet, kept them under control, but the weight of Tommy's death hung over them. It was a cloud that wouldn't clear, no matter how hard they tried to ignore it. No one spoke about Tommy much, but his absence was palpable, like a missing piece of the puzzle. The crew had lost its balance, and no amount of money could fix that. Every day, Jimmy would go over the plans again, reaffirming the need for caution, for patience. He would say, "Stay low, stay quiet, don't get caught up in the money," but Henry saw the cracks in his leadership. Jimmy wasn't as calm as he had once been. The cracks were showing, his jaw tightening when he heard sirens in the distance, his eyes darting around when a car passed too slowly. Jimmy was beginning to feel the pressure of everything slipping away. Henry couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time, that their brief moment of safety was over before it ever really began. He tried to push the thoughts away, tried to focus on what they had left, but it was hard. Every minute, every hour, felt like they were teetering on the edge of something worse. One evening, as they sat around the small kitchen table, eating a quiet meal, the silence was finally broken by a knock at the door. It was quick, sharp, too deliberate to be casual. Henry's heart skipped a beat, and his eyes immediately went to Jimmy. The room fell still, the air thick with unspoken tension. Jimmy's eyes narrowed, his expression shifting as if a switch had been flipped. Without a word, he stood up slowly and walked to the door, his movements calculated. Henry could hear the soft scrape of his shoes on the floor, the silence so loud in the cabin it felt like it was closing in on them. He opened the door just a crack, peering outside before stepping back slightly. For a brief moment, Henry couldn't make out the figure standing in the doorway, but the way Jimmy's body stiffened told him everything. The look on Jimmy's face said it all. This wasn't someone they were expecting. "Who is it?" Henry asked, his voice barely a whisper. Jimmy didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped away from the door, his face set with determination. "It's him," Jimmy said quietly, his voice tinged with something Henry couldn't place. "The man who's been looking for us." Henry's heart raced. This was it. The man who had been hunting them down. The man who had shown up at the warehouse, who had killed Tommy without a second thought, had finally found them. Jimmy didn't waste any time. He grabbed his gun from the table and motioned for the others to follow him quietly. The crew moved like shadows, instinctively falling into place. They hadn't survived this long by sitting still. Every move they made now was a step toward survival, but Henry could feel the fear creeping up on him. The door opened again, and Jimmy stepped into the dim light of the cabin's small entryway. There was no room for hesitation. They were going to face it head-on. Henry stayed close behind, his fingers tight around the grip of his own weapon. He had been in situations like this before, but this felt different. This wasn't just about getting the money, it was about getting out alive. The man at the door wasn't alone. He had two others with him, both towering over Jimmy. But Jimmy wasn't afraid. He wasn't backing down. Henry could see that now. It was all or nothing. "You've been hard to find," the man at the door said, his voice low, almost taunting. "But we've got a good sense of where you're hiding, Jimmy. You can't keep running." Jimmy stood tall, his posture rigid, but his eyes were sharp. "We're not running," he replied, his voice calm. "You're here for the money, but you're not getting it." The man's lips curled into a smirk. "I think you'll find that you don't have much of a choice." In that moment, time seemed to slow. Henry could see the two men behind the leader, their eyes scanning the room. They weren't here to talk. They were here to finish what they had started. "Get out," Jimmy said, his voice like ice. "You came for the money, but it's not yours. Now you leave." The man laughed, and the sound was cold, bitter. "You think you're in control here, Jimmy? You're not. This is bigger than you think. You don't just get to take millions and walk away clean." It was a threat, and it wasn't the first one they'd heard, but this time, there was something different. The man wasn't bluffing. And the longer they waited, the more dangerous it would become. Without warning, the man lunged forward, and before Henry could react, a shot rang out. The man crumpled to the floor, his gun falling from his hand as he hit the ground with a sickening thud. Jimmy was still holding his gun, his eyes steady as the smoke from the shot hung in the air. The other two men hesitated, but Jimmy didn't give them a chance. He fired two quick shots, one for each of them. They dropped to the ground without a sound. Henry stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. He had seen Jimmy in action before, but this was different. There was no hesitation, no mercy. This wasn't a man protecting his crew. This was a man who knew that there was no way out unless he fought for it. Jimmy turned slowly, his eyes cold, his gun still raised. "We're leaving," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "No more waiting. No more hiding. This ends tonight." The crew didn't need to be told twice. They grabbed their gear and moved toward the door. As they stepped out into the night, Henry couldn't shake the feeling that they were past the point of no return. This wasn't just about the money anymore. This was about survival. The night air was colder than it had been in weeks as the crew moved swiftly through the darkened streets, adrenaline coursing through their veins. The sound of distant sirens had barely faded when Jimmy slammed the door of the van shut, the tires screeching as they tore out of the parking lot. Every second felt like an eternity, but Henry knew there was no turning back now. They had made it out, barely, but the city was closing in, and so was the danger. Jimmy was silent, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, his jaw tight with the weight of what they'd just done. He had killed without hesitation, without remorse, and that thought lingered heavily in the air. This wasn't just a heist anymore. It was survival. And it seemed that, in this world, survival came at the expense of everything else. Tommy's death felt like a distant memory now, a part of the past that was impossible to change. But Henry couldn't shake the image of his body lying on the warehouse floor, a reminder that none of them were safe, not even the ones who had always seemed untouchable. It wasn't just the money anymore. It was the price of staying alive, the price of the choices they had made. As the van sped through the city's outskirts, the crew's silence was deafening. No one spoke. No one had to. The reality of what had happened, what they had done, hung in the air like a cloud. The road ahead seemed endless, a blur of streetlights and shadows that shifted like ghosts in the night. They were running, but they didn't know where to. Jimmy took a sharp turn, heading toward a quiet industrial area on the edge of town. It was secluded, tucked away from the usual hustle and bustle, perfect for laying low. He pulled into an empty parking lot behind a warehouse, the tires squealing as they came to a halt. "We stay here," Jimmy said, his voice steady but his eyes betraying the weariness that had begun to show. "We get some rest, regroup, and then we figure out what's next." Henry didn't question him. He was too exhausted to think, too numb to argue. He followed the others as they climbed out of the van, the cold air biting at his skin. The crew moved in silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts, trying to come to terms with the chaos they'd just caused. The warehouse was dark and empty, with only the faint hum of the city in the distance. It was a safe place, for now, but Henry knew it wouldn't be long before the danger found them again. It never did. In this world, danger was always just around the corner. Inside the warehouse, the crew set up a temporary camp, huddled in the cold as they tried to catch their breath. Jimmy paced back and forth, his mind clearly working on the next step. There was no rest for him. The man who had killed Tommy was still out there, and now they were marked. The target had shifted from the money to their lives. Henry sat against the wall, his head spinning with the weight of everything. His hands trembled slightly, the adrenaline still running through him like a wildfire. They were running out of time. The heat was closing in, and Henry could feel it in the pit of his stomach. "Jimmy," Henry said quietly, his voice rough, "what now? What do we do?" Jimmy stopped pacing and turned to face him. His eyes were cold, calculating, but there was something else there too, something darker. "We don't stop," he said, his voice low. "We keep moving, keep the money out of sight, and we wait for the right time to get out." Henry shook his head, frustration creeping in. "You don't get it, do you? It's not just about the money anymore. We're not running from the law. We're running from people who are going to kill us. They'll find us. And when they do, it'll be over." Jimmy didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. "We're not getting caught," he said firmly. "We'll keep moving. And when the heat dies down, we disappear." Henry wanted to argue, wanted to tell Jimmy that it wasn't that simple. But he knew better. Jimmy had always been the one with the plan, the one who called the shots. And right now, that plan was to survive, no matter what it took. The night passed in tense silence. The crew slept fitfully, their eyes darting open at every creak of the building, every sound in the distance. They were waiting for something they couldn't control, but they knew it was coming. The next morning, they packed up and moved out. The van rumbled to life again, and they drove through the empty streets, keeping a low profile, trying to blend in with the shadows. But Henry couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. It wasn't just paranoia anymore, it was a gut feeling. They had crossed a line, and there was no going back. As the van turned onto a quieter street, Henry's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. There, in the distance, was a car, too close, too steady. Henry's heart skipped a beat. He could feel the walls closing in. They weren't going to get out of this. Not unscathed, not without paying the price. He turned to Jimmy, his voice low but urgent. "Jimmy, they're onto us." Jimmy's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, and for the first time, Henry saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. But it was gone in an instant. Jimmy slammed his foot on the accelerator, the van lurching forward as they sped through the streets, taking sharp turns and cutting through alleys. The chase had begun. The engine roared as Jimmy pushed the van harder, taking corners at breakneck speed. The screech of tires against pavement echoed in the empty streets, a sound that seemed to grow louder with each passing second. They were being followed. Henry could feel it in his bones, could see the car in the rearview mirror closing in. "Stay calm," Jimmy's voice came from the front, steady, but there was a thin edge to it now. He was no longer the calm, calculating leader he had once been. The chase had broken him too. Tommy was dead. They had lost control. And now, the price of that loss was catching up with them. "We can't outrun them, Jimmy," Henry said, his voice strained with the pressure. "They're on us. We need to make a move." Jimmy's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, but he didn't slow down. He had made up his mind. He wasn't going to go down without a fight. "I said stay calm. I've got this." But even Henry knew that this wasn't just about staying calm. They were out of options. They had burned too many bridges, and now they were running for their lives. The city wasn't big enough to hide them, and the man who had taken Tommy's life wasn't going to stop until he finished what he started. The van tore through the back streets, swerving to avoid traffic, cutting through alleys. They were getting closer to the edge of town now, to a place where the streets were less crowded, where they could lose themselves in the maze of warehouses and industrial parks. But the car behind them wasn't backing off. It was getting closer. "We need a plan," Henry said, his mind racing as they turned another corner. "We're not getting away on just speed." Jimmy's grip on the wheel tightened, his knuckles going white. He didn't respond right away. Instead, his eyes darted from the road ahead to the rearview mirror, and Henry saw something change in his face, a flicker of something darker. This wasn't just about the heist anymore. This wasn't about the money. This was about survival. Without warning, Jimmy slammed the brakes. The van lurched forward, the sudden stop throwing Henry against the seatbelt. "What the hell?" he yelled, barely managing to catch his breath. But before anyone could react, Jimmy threw the van into reverse and floored the gas pedal. The rear tires squealed as the van shot backward, faster than Henry thought possible. The car behind them, caught off guard, slammed into the rear bumper of the van, pushing it slightly, but it wasn't enough to stop them. "Hold on!" Jimmy barked as the van skidded around the corner, narrowly avoiding a parked truck. Henry gritted his teeth, clutching the seat, trying to steady himself. He could see the car in the rearview mirror, now gaining on them again. Whoever was driving had no intention of letting them go. "Jimmy, this isn't working!" Henry shouted. "They're not going to stop." But Jimmy was focused. His eyes were narrowed, his lips set in a hard line. He wasn't just running. He was calculating, thinking 3 moves ahead. "We get rid of them, or we get away," Jimmy muttered, barely audible over the sound of screeching tires. "One way or another, it ends now." Henry's heart pounded in his chest. He had seen Jimmy make cold decisions before, but this felt different. They weren't just trying to escape anymore. They were being hunted, and the person chasing them wasn't going to stop until they had taken everything. With a sudden jerk, Jimmy turned the van down another narrow alley, slamming the brakes again. The van's tires skidded, but they managed to make the sharp turn. Jimmy slammed the gearshift into park and threw open the door. "Get out!" he shouted. "Now!" The crew scrambled out of the van, their feet hitting the cold pavement, and Henry barely had time to process what was happening before Jimmy pulled out a handgun from under his jacket. "Follow me, stay low," Jimmy ordered, his voice sharp, commanding. He motioned for Henry and the others to move behind him as they dashed toward the nearest building, taking cover behind the crates and stacked boxes in the alley. Henry's heart was pounding in his chest as he ducked behind the crates, trying to steady his breath. His mind was racing, there was no plan now, just survival. They were trapped in the city, surrounded by enemies, and the money they had stolen was nothing more than a target on their backs. The sound of the car's engine grew louder as it neared the alley. Henry peeked around the corner, watching as the black sedan pulled into view. It slowed, its headlights cutting through the darkness, but it didn't stop. The car moved past them, but Henry knew it was just a matter of time before they realized the trap. They weren't in control anymore. Jimmy raised his gun, ready to make a move. The crew huddled together, their bodies tense, waiting for the signal. And then, just as the car passed, the man at the wheel slammed the brakes. The moment was a blur. Jimmy fired first, the shot ringing out in the narrow alley. The man in the car jerked back, the car swerving as the driver lost control. The vehicle skidded to the side, crashing into a stack of metal barrels. The world fell silent again. The crew waited, not moving, listening for any sound that would signal danger. But the street was still. Jimmy lowered his gun. "It's done," he said, his voice cold but steady. For a moment, no one moved. Henry could still feel the weight of what had just happened, the death, the chase, the mess they had created. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for now, they had bought themselves time. They moved quickly, disappearing into the shadows of the alley, slipping away like ghosts into the city night. But Henry knew it wasn't over. They had just entered a new game, one where the stakes were higher than ever. The streets were quieter now, but the sense of danger never faded. Jimmy led the crew through the maze of alleyways, his steps steady but his mind racing. The sound of sirens still echoed in the distance, a constant reminder that they hadn't gotten away clean. No one said anything, but each of them knew the truth: they were running out of time. Henry kept his head down, eyes scanning the shadows around them. The adrenaline from the chase was wearing off, but the tension was still thick in the air. The money wasn't a prize anymore. It was a burden, a curse that had turned them into fugitives. They weren't running from the law anymore. They were running from something far worse. They had just killed 3 men in cold blood. And they knew that wasn't going to be the last of it. As they approached an old, decrepit building on the edge of the city, Jimmy stopped. He turned to the crew, his face grim. The time for running was over. They needed to make a decision, and they needed to make it fast. "We can't keep doing this," Jimmy said, his voice low. "The money's gone. We've burned every bridge. We're marked men." Henry's chest tightened as Jimmy's words hit him like a ton of bricks. He had known this was coming, the inevitability of it all. The dream of the heist, the rush of getting away with millions, had faded the moment Tommy's blood hit the floor. They were too deep now, and they didn't have the luxury of turning back. "What do we do now?" Henry asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jimmy looked at him, his eyes hard. "We finish it." It wasn't a plan. It was a death sentence. For the first time since Tommy's death, Henry felt a flicker of fear deep in his gut. Jimmy had always been the one to keep them in line, to show them the way out. But now, Henry realized, Jimmy didn't have the answers anymore. Jimmy was as trapped as the rest of them. "We get rid of the money," Jimmy continued, his voice tight. "We lay low. But not here. We can't stay in the city anymore. They'll be looking for us, and they'll find us if we stay. We're leaving." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and final. Henry didn't say anything, but he felt the weight of it all. They had no choice. Jimmy had given them an order, and they had to follow it, whether they wanted to or not. They spent the next few hours preparing to leave. They burned whatever they could, documents, anything that could tie them to the heist. They couldn't afford to leave any trace behind. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about survival. They had crossed a line, and now they were marked for death. When the van finally rolled out of the parking lot, the city skyline receding in the distance, Henry couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It wasn't paranoia. It was instinct. They had done too much, taken too much, and the world had a way of finding out the truth. Jimmy kept his eyes on the road, his grip tight on the wheel. He wasn't looking for an escape. He was looking for a place to vanish, to disappear completely. He had a plan, he always did, but this time, Henry wasn't sure if it would work. As they drove through the night, Henry's thoughts kept drifting back to Tommy. He could still see his face, still hear his voice. Tommy had always been reckless, always had a chip on his shoulder, but he was one of them. He had been part of their crew. And now he was gone, taken by the very world they had tried to conquer. The van stopped at a secluded warehouse on the outskirts of town. It was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of street lamps in the distance. Jimmy looked at the crew, his face impassive, but there was something darker in his eyes now, something that hadn't been there before. "This is where we ended," Jimmy said quietly. "We lay low here for a while. We disappear." Henry didn't ask where they would go. It didn't matter. There was no place for them to hide now. The money was gone, and the life they had known was over. They moved quickly, unloading the van and securing the area. The warehouse was old, abandoned, and perfect for laying low. Jimmy had already made arrangements. They would disappear, lay low, and hope the heat died down. But Henry knew the truth. The heat would never die down. They had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The world they had built, the empire they thought they could control, had already crumbled. "Do you ever think we were wrong?" Henry asked, his voice hoarse. Jimmy didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared out at the city in the distance, the flickering lights of the skyline barely visible against the darkness. "No," Jimmy finally said, his voice low. "We did what we had to do. We made our choices." Henry knew that was all Jimmy could say. The past was gone, and there was no way to change it. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: they would have to keep moving. They would have to keep running, keep fighting, until there was nothing left. But as Henry stood in the shadow of the warehouse, staring out at the empty road ahead, he couldn't help but feel the weight of what they had lost. They had taken everything, and in the end, it wasn't worth the price.